malfunctioning today. So no camera, unfortunately. But yes, like all of you said, I want to talk a little bit about kind of my time in graduate school and as well how that kind of transitioned into a successful career. And as we go through this talk, I want to have you think about a few things in your life. How do you manage your time? How do you reference literature? Do you use a citation manager? How do you read scientific articles? Because it's not always straightforward. There's different approaches. How do you know what is important when you're doing your lab studies, when you're doing your experiments, when you're doing your simulation runs? What sticks out to you? What deems it important? How do you write a paper? Some of these things seem trivial, but when you get down and actually doing it, it's really challenging. Additionally, how do you know when it is time to publish? You spend so much time reading the literature, finding holes in what is out there, and at a certain point, you start to poke those own holes in your own work. So how do you know when it's time to publish? And as you're going through your graduate studies, whether it be a master's, a PhD, whatever it may be, I want you to keep this T chart in the back of your head. When you finish your degree, you are going to be a technical expert in your field. You're going to dive really deep into your specific field that you're studying, as you should. You're going to have a master's or PhD in that subject. But along the way, you should keep in mind of the adjacent fields in your studies. These could be fields that your lab mates are pursuing or other colleagues at the school. Be generally aware and understand what they're doing, because as in my case, as an example, I did not find a career that was directly linked to my field of true technical specialty. And we'll see that a little bit later. Something that I found really helpful is to visualize kind of my productivity and my confidence, as you could say, by year going through grad school. And for me, it took 5 years to finish my PhD. And you can see that first year you start off, it's okay. There's a lot of nervous anxiety, but you feel good. You're learning. You're feeling like you're moving towards the goal, which is your dissertation. And somewhere along the way, things don't go so well, and your confidence plummets, and you kind of fall into this little pit of despair. Um, but eventually you keep working at this and you keep persevering. And ultimately, you not only work your way out of it, but you come out of it even faster than you went into it. And let's just take a peek at kind of this curve in a little bit more detail, because life is not this smooth, right? Uh, from day to day, week to week, you have little victories, and then things don't go so well. Things kind of go up and down as you're along this, multi-year journey through grad school. And looking at the first year, I'm sure it's very similar for everyone else on the call. You take your first year courses, you're getting exposed to lab techniques for the first time, and overall, you're learning methods and knowledge that already exist. They're well defined, and you feel really good. You're making progress. And then in year two, you really hone in on that research topic. And for many, you're going to begin experiments, really testing that knowledge and testing your ideas. And along the way, at some point, things stop working. For me, nothing was working right. My equipment was broken. I was getting contradictory results. And as everyone that is planning to publish on this call, you need to be able to have reproducible results before you can go and inform the scientific community of your work. And so things weren't going so well for me. And then year four, things just started clicking. I was writing papers, and things were, really moving well. I was feeling great. And then all of a sudden, there was a little hiccup for me. That was COVID. I think a lot of us experienced 2020. And for me, year four fell in 2020. And so there were a few hiccups there, and I'll touch on some of those unexpected setbacks. But ultimately, in year five, able to wrap up those projects, publish those papers, and defend, which just felt fantastic. And some of the key milestones I just want to include at the bottom. In year two, I presented at a conference. Year three, even though nothing was really going well, I presented at two conferences. And then year four, as things were starting to take off, published one paper, and then in my final year, I published two more. Um, and now, if we were to zoom in a little bit on year one, I have this little chart up in the top right to kind of keep track of where we're at in the journey of grad school. Year one, the best way I can describe it is that there's this excitement and optimism that you're experiencing. And so overall, you're really pumped up and energized. For me, that looked like I was taking courses. I was selecting an advisor in a research group that I was going to call home for the next 4 or more years. I was reading papers. I was learning lab techniques, and I even began my first research project. Um, all things just very exciting, and I felt like I was being a contributor. And from this first year, the real big takeaways for me were learning the keywords of my field, knowing what to search for in the sea of scientific literature. And I got these keywords from my lab mates, my advisors, as well as recommended papers and previous work from the lab. And something that I learned in that year is that searching scientific databases is a little different than just using Google. You use the same search criteria and you go to 4 or 5 different databases, you will get different results. And so it's important that even though you maybe prefer one database, always do a sanity check with the other databases with the same search credentials, just to make sure you're not missing any work. Make sure someone hasn't already done your idea. Because that would be the worst case scenario, getting all the way to the end only to find out that the work was done 5 years ago. And then something too is methods for reading papers. Now, this outline that I give here, this is more of once you settle into the field, but really the way that I go about reading a paper nowadays, I skim the abstract to see if it's a paper talking about what I'm interested in. On the off chance that it is, I then go to the conclusions and I see what was the most important discovery of this work. And is that something that I'm interested in? Because the authors will 100% put the most important information in the conclusions because they know that's where I'm going next. And then let's say I'm intrigued by the conclusions of the study. The next thing I want to do is see the data for myself. The data is housed in the figures of the paper. So that's where I'm going to go next. And if the figures have show some interesting trends, then I dive into the discussion surrounding those figures. And then say that, yes, this is really an interesting approach. I want to understand more of how maybe to reproduce it myself. And so I'll read their methods. And if I'm new to the field or just want to understand a little bit more of the background on this specific study, I'll read the introduction. So very much a different approach compared to how the paper is laid out. Now, in year two, now remember, we're kind of like right at this productivity confidence like cliff. And the best way I can describe it is that there is still time. The reason why I say that is because I'm kind of doing the same thing that I was in year one. I'm still doing experiments, I'm still reading papers. And by the way, the experiments that I performed in year one and year two led to one of my papers in year four. So um, just keep in mind for that in a little bit. Um, in year two, it's still a little exciting because I was able to identify that research area of interest that I really care about, that I was really passionate about. And for me, that was polymer composites manufacturing and being able to scale that into a high production volume environment. I completed that project that I had mentioned back in year one, wrote the report, handed it over to the company. And in the back of my, for some of these experiments, for the report, it was fine, but I was doing additional experiments and I was getting some contradictory results. And I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew I still had time to figure it out. And so I wasn't too worried. Hence there is still time. Things are starting to, show some cracks in the system, but I still have plenty of time left. And I was able to design some manufacturing equipment and put that order in, something that I knew was critical for my year three onward. And things that I learned, this is a little bit of a spoiler, and specifically for this paper, is use a citation manager. When you are preparing the work cited for a paper, you need to stay organized, especially in my case where I read the papers in year one and two, did the work, and then didn't publish it until year four. Now that's on me, I know, but this is all too common. And so if you are able to use a citation manager and keep organized those papers and mark those as this is definitely part of paper one, paper two, paper three, you're going to thank yourself when you go back to actually write that thing. And so start those good habits now. The best time, the easiest time you will have writing your method section is while you're doing the work. And so if you're able to write down in detail what those methods were in a style conducive for a research paper, then you're going to be in really good shape. And I could not encourage you enough to identify what that journal is that you are interested in publishing in and download that journal template ahead of time and work and put all of your writing into that template. And this may seem like an easy goal in a vacuum, but it's really challenging to be able to read a paper every week, regardless of the direct relevance, just to stay informed and up to date with your field more broadly. If you are able to do that, that means that you read 52 papers in a year, which is a pretty impressive feat. And again, just keep organized. And I put it in all caps, citation managers, in case you aren't using one. There are three kind of popular ones that I would say. One is EndNote, put on by Clarivate. Another is Mendeley, published by Elsevier. And then there's an open source one, Zotero. It really doesn't matter which of these citation managers you use. They all have very similar features and functionality. And it really comes down to a personal preference and a bit of a lab preference. So if you already have an established culture with one of these in your lab group, I highly recommend you stick to that one. It makes it a little bit easier to pass publications and citations back and forth and share kind of like a accumulated works cited that you're working on for maybe a co-authored paper. And in these, you can take notes directly on the PDF. And so it's really handy to be able to keep kind of the mental notes or takeaways that you had for each of those papers. Now, year three, I'm sure you were noticing that on the productivity chart, and maybe you're experiencing that right now. For me, nothing works, and I don't feel like I have any time left. For me, my equipment was delayed over a year, a totally unexpected setback. And even when it arrived, there were still additional delays because this was some pretty heavy duty equipment. It needed to be installed properly, commissioned, and all of that. So it took just a lot of time. While that was a huge setback, I did get to go to 2 conferences, and something that was really exciting for me because I was starting to get quite dejected by my progress. And that was that when I presented my work, the rooms were standing room only. People wanted to hear what I had to talk about, which really gave me a lot of confidence, even though I was all the way down in the pits here. As mentioned before, my lab experiments, they just were not reproducible. My experimental results seemed illogical. And I put a little note here, or so I thought. I realized later on that actually there was a new novel trend going on that I was able to demonstrate, but we'll get there in a bit. And then finally, there were new students joining the lab. And so me being the third year, a senior member of the lab, we now needed to train up the next generation of students. And so during this sort of down year, um, one of the biggest takeaways for me was having a few topics active for me to keep my mind distracted when like the major topics that I was really banking on just weren't panning out. So I kept a few small passion projects on the side. These were separate experiments that I was running. And I was also learning a lot about others in the group. So remember that T chart, that adjacent fields? I was learning more about simulation techniques. I was learning more about different material systems and different manufacturing methods. And it really helped expand my knowledge and really helped me later to start my career. Um, it's sometimes it's because of all these struggles, not being able to reproduce things, you sometimes will find yourself banging your head against a wall. And so this, I found myself in this situation. I was working 12 or 14 hours straight in the lab, and so it was rolling well into the early hours of the morning. And at hour 12, at hour 13, at hour 14, at hour 15, at that point, it doesn't really matter. If it wasn't coming to you in the first 10 hours, it's not going to magically appear the right answer to you in another 6 hours without that sleep. So it's better to just go home, get a rest, and come back fresh and mentally sharp. And this was also something where I was keeping my up with my hobbies outside of the lab, just to keep my mind engaged elsewhere when things weren't going so well um, within the research. Um, and then these last two comments really pertain to these new students joining the lab. Um, when when they're joining, they're going to be just like you in year one. They're not going to be super familiar with reading research papers. And one of the best ways for new students to learn how to read papers is for everyone in the research group to read the same paper and then have the new student present the key results or in their key takeaways from that paper, and then allow a dialogue and a discussion to follow with all of the senior members in the lab having also read that paper. And you'll be fascinated to see how multiple people can have different key takeaways from the same paper, especially even one that's in their fields. And then finally, just mentoring those new students. It was really something for me that was therapeutic when everything else was kind of crumbling around me. Now, I do want to really focus in on this mentoring students because it really promotes a healthy research group. And it's something to kind of give back to the group as you become a senior member yourself. And that is showing them the ropes of the lab, introducing them to lab techniques, showing them how to read a paper, start a journal club, which was basically the concept I was describing previously, where you um, read the same paper and then one person presents on it. And as a senior member at this point, year 3, year 4, you may be preparing papers of your own for publication. Have them read it, give feedback on your paper. It'll both help them, they'll learn something, and they can offer some maybe grammar feedback and some things like that. Show them how to write a conference paper. Show them kind of the technique of drafting an abstract for a conference paper. And then, you might have published a couple journal papers at this time. So show them your approach to writing that journal paper. Downloading the template from the journal, making sure that the journal you select aligns with the topic of your paper. And then these will also help reinforce your own skills by teaching others. Now, Year four, which I have to say, um, was definitely something I needed. Everything was clicking together, and now it just felt like a race against the clock to get everything done. I felt like I had not just a path forward, but I feel like I had a map chartered with this path. I knew where every turn was going to take me. My equipment was operational. I was in nonstop data collection mode. Wrote my first paper. Again, that was from data from years one and two. And so I had a little bit of a setback having to kind of refresh my memory on what papers were relevant so that I could cite them. Um, I proposed and began my own research topic that was aligned with the equipment that I had produced or designed, I should say. And then year four, 2020, I got locked out of the lab. And so that was that kind of little skid along the way. But it wasn't a total skid. I didn't take, two steps backwards. I pivoted. Uh, my field was so focused on experimental work. However, I pivoted to computational work because I felt that I could not lose those 4 months. I no longer felt like I had time to waste, time to try and figure things out. And so I looked to computational techniques to replace some of the experimental work I was planning. And then because of that time being locked out of the lab, it was this silver lining because it gave me time to go back to that year three data that I thought was total nonsense. And it turns out it wasn't. It was actually had a novel trend, and I was able to publish a paper in that area. It was on these kidney bean shaped fibers. And basically, they compacted in a very strange way, but they were commercially viable fibers. And so I went through an approach to show its value um, and how it differed from circular fibers, let's say. And so some of the takeaways, I realized that in year four, I was starting to mentor more new students at the lab, and I understood way more than I realized. I knew way more about the equipment than I realized, more about the lab techniques that I realized. I was starting to do things in an afternoon, and if I let one of the younger students in the lab do those same things, it might take a week or two to get the same results. And so that was like a real sanity check of saying, hey, you know what? I am actually learning quite a bit. And I have come a long way since the starting point. And I learned to never say never. I didn't say this at the beginning, but I never wanted to do anything with computational work. I only wanted to do experimental work. But this kind of forced my hand. And you'll see later on that it actually opened the doors to employment for me at Hexagon. Um, and then also, it gave me time to question my assumptions about that year three data and show that it wasn't total nonsense. And finally, writing takes time. It was longer than I thought. I got a lot of feedback from my lab mates because I was not super strong in my writing. And so it really helped to get feedback from my peers. Um, and one thing that I do not recommend is that I switched citation managers during this time because I wanted to use one that was better with my collaborators. Uh, and it took, for me, quite a bit to migrate over to that system. And so I felt like this could be a good time to talk about some of the lessons learned for myself when writing my first paper, which was this kind of pure kinetics paper. It was a chemistry paper, let's say. And the absolute first thing you have to do is do your pre-writing checklist. Identify that target journal, download that paper template, read the publishing guidelines, because this will tell you if you are in the right journal, and it will also help you start to lay out your paper accordingly to the preferences of the journal. The next thing you do, you don't start writing. You form all of the figures you need for the paper. And when I say all, I mean every single one of them nicely formatted as you would expect it to be in the journal, in the paper. And then you present those figures, sorry, in order to your group and make sure that they tell a story, that they tell the right story. And once you know that that story is being told correctly, that is when you dive in and start writing the sections and putting that story to words. And it doesn't really matter where you start, which sections you write, because they're all sort of compartmentalized. I recommend doing the methods because they are literally a recipe for how you did the work. And so it should be the easiest to write. For me, I then like to give a discussion around the figures, then write the conclusions, and then finally go back and write the literature review for the introduction. And once all of the sections were together, then I would give it to my fellow grad students to get their feedback. Now, year five, it was an absolute sprint, but I was almost becoming comfortable in the constant, 10, 12 hours a day kind of working, grinding to get to the finish line because I saw that finish line. I finished my final industry report in that year. I was done collecting data. And that was, for me, a beautiful benchmark because at that point, I knew that I only had about 2 to 3 months left to finish writing, finish all of the papers, finish the dissertation, and defend. And then for me, I found it very helpful to shift my hours a little bit to more quiet time in the lab when less people were in there, just because as you become a more senior member, uh, you've experienced a lot of the problems in the lab. And so a lot of the younger students will come to you when they encounter those problems, which is of course fine, but it can really break up the workflow with writing. And so for me, in this year, I realized that writing a paper and a dissertation are not the same thing. Uh, for that first chapter of your dissertation, you really need a robust, comprehensive literature review for that introduction chapter. You really need to demonstrate that you have read through the papers in your field. And then while the chapters of your dissertation can resemble your papers, the dissertation contains more of a narrative of your thoughts and the scientific method of the work that you're showing. So it should be more complete than what is in the journal papers. And finally, I had a realization that I did know a lot more than I realized, which was really reassuring going into kind of that preparing for my defense. I wasn't so concerned about what questions may be asked of me. And now I've hinted at this, but as you go through grad school, there's there's a lot of unexpected things that happen along the way. For me, I went and did chemistry kinetics. I then realized that I wasn't looking at nonsensical data and actually had something really novel in solid mechanics. And then COVID, I guess you could say, threw me a curveball. And I had to pivot away from my experimental approaches to a simulation way of thinking. And I couldn't have been more appreciative of this, not at the time, but now, because it really paved the way for me to get my first job after grad school, which was working for Hexagon. And while Hexagon is a technology company, they do offer quite a few simulation and analysis tools. And so they have finite element analysis tools, multi-body dynamics. And for me, I stumbled across their computational fluid dynamics tools, which was in that publication. But they also have acoustics, material modeling, and a whole host of other software. And I mention this because this allowed me to get my first job in industry. And I want to share how that transition occurred after we go through some lessons learned. So I learned how to manage my time. Going back to that example where I was spending over 12 hours in the lab, if the deadline is not tomorrow, try again the next day, get a good night's sleep, and refresh yourself. You're not going to make some major scientific breakthrough at 4 a.m. Really take advantage of your hobbies, really enjoy them. If it's video games, if it's hiking, whatever it may be, make sure you have time in your day to enjoy those things. And then finally, things don't always go according to plan. And so having a few active areas of interest, either in research or whatever it may be in the lab, really help to mitigate the feeling of a setback when you encounter them. And then how to read a paper. It may seem totally mundane and straightforward, but really focus in on the paper's conclusions. Does the data back up those conclusions? Then go to their methods and see how they did it, right? You really want to make sure that you can trust that paper. And then be organized when you're reading. Take notes. Make sure you file them away in a citation manager that makes sense to you. During the literature review, mark those papers. Make sure that you highlight which papers you want to cite and why you want to cite them. And then I maybe glossed over this a little bit, but knowing when to publish. Because I mentioned collecting data in year 1 and year 2, not touching it in year 3, and then publishing it in year 4. Knowing when you should publish is when you are able to create all of the figures in a nicely formatted way that just tells a complete story. When the data can tell a story and it makes sense, that's when you should start writing. And then always get input from your lab mates. Besides your advisor, they're going to be the next people on this earth that are going to understand your work, because you should be sharing those little mini milestones along the way with your peers. And then finally, knowing what's important. Mentoring your lab mates, it reinforces what you know and how you understand things. It helps you broaden your knowledge, reinforces that knowledge, and you're just in general being a good steward of the science and shared spaces that you have. Now, how does all of this translate to industry? And so for myself, I've had about 2.5 years working in industry. I started in August 2021, then had 2 complete years, and 2024 has barely started. Now, I joined Hexagon as a manufacturing solutions integration engineer. And in all reality, this was a totally new department for the company. So the position was not well defined. And that's important in just a moment. So going through the onboarding, there was a 2-week kind of focused onboarding period. And then there's something that I would say was more of like a 6-month kind of shadowing period, where I was attending a lot of meetings with other people on my team. I was traveling to customer sites and potential customer sites, really learning a lot more about their specific manufacturing problems. And at this point, I should mention that my little T where I dive deep into a field, that was all composites manufacturing work. Whereas the companies that I was working with, some of them were doing composite techniques that were outside of what I had really looked at as a grad student. And other ones, they were looking at metal additive manufacturing, something that was just totally foreign to me. So I had to do a little bit of background reading to kind of get brought up to speed with it. Similarly, I was looking at ceramic matrix composites, something totally different from polymer composites. And so I needed to wrap my head around it in kind of a meaningful way. And that doesn't mean that I needed to become an expert, but I needed to find the folks in my company that did understand this and learn from them, and learn just enough to be dangerous, as I like to say. Now, about a year into that, there was a change of business direction. And so I actually had to pivot my role from a manufacturing solutions integration engineer over to a program manager for our academics. And actually, as I switched roles, that's when I not only got that first large project proposal, but also a second significantly larger one that was related back to my time as a manufacturing solutions engineer. And so I was actually able to, while being the program manager, my manager still afforded me some time to oversee the relationship with these projects, as well as manage the overall direction of them, which was really important for me in my career growth, because I really wanted to continue to stay technical in my field, as well as just engineering fields more broadly. In my second full year with Hexagon, I actually had a third project accepted, still as my role as an integration engineer. And I actually have a fourth project submitted, and we'll see if that goes through. If so, then it'll, um, we'll see what happens. But also in that term, I became a people manager. I started to lean on that time as being a mentor in grad school, and now I'm actually applying it to being a people manager. And then I also had to deal with some additional setbacks, right? I had a setback. Well, I shouldn't call it a setback, a pivot of career. And then I did have a setback where I had turnover on my team. Basically, one of my direct reports took on a new role, and I needed to find someone to fill that vacancy. And so I did. Um, but you have to readjust your goals and expectations um, for that year when you're lost some of the manpower like that. And then in year four, I'm really focused on establishing annual goals for my program and just building scalable solutions that can kind of fit well into this larger structure, right? So I'm overseeing 15,000 students at the moment. So I'm trying to find ways with limited resources to be able to offer support to a large number of students. And so, yeah, I would say that the major takeaways translating from grad school is that, uh, be a technical expert in your field, but really keep your eyes open to what's happening around you. Because you're not necessarily going to find a role that directly matches your skill set one to one. And so having those additional skills really, really help your job prospects down the road. Um, Being very cognizant of when setbacks happen and being able to manage those setbacks in a reasonable way. Um, while yes, it was absolutely helpful in graduate school, it doesn't go away in life. You're going to experience that both in your personal life, but also in your career. And so being able to identify the problem and be able to work around it and adjust as needed are really valuable skills to have and things that will kind of help keep you in a successful career path. Um, and with that, I guess one last thing I should mention is that a lot of the simulation tools that I used in my graduate studies, as well as just a variety of others that Hexagon offers, are all free to students. So you can just search Hexagon Student Edition and go and download it for yourself. Um, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions. My contact information is up on the screen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex, for such a wonderful presentation. So it's now time for me to turn to the audience. If you have any questions for Dr. Alex, please feel free to ask your questions. So if you want to ask a question, just raise up your hand and I'll allow you to speak.
And don't feel pressured to ask a question now. If you want to just connect on LinkedIn or send me an email, I'm always happy to answer any question.
That's fine too. Yeah. Dr. Alex, my question will be, what suggestions will you give, like a research group on how they can make, the experiences that students who join the research group will have at the end of the day, like in terms of interpersonal interactions and like the culture of such research groups. Do you have some suggestions you'll give?
Yeah. The first thing I want to say is communicate. I remember when I was coming into the lab, I would always ask my group mates at some point during the day how things were going, what experiments were you planning this week, and then later on throughout the week, I would ask, how'd they go? Is there anything interesting? And sometimes people can be defensive about this if things aren't going well or they haven't figured it out themselves, because there is a certain, feeling that you should be able to figure it out. You're a grad student, things like that. But in reality, really being open and sharing kind of those problems really help get you over those little hurdles. They might say, oh, like the machine failed in this way, the test didn't finish, um, my solver didn't converge. And then you might say, hey, you know what? I actually experienced that a month ago. For me, it was this. Have you tried that? And that, like, once you start to get a few of those kind of interactions in, then all of a sudden, people are a lot more happy and upbeat to share what they're up to because, hey, maybe you can help me with my problem. That's what I would say.
So communication, trying to share, uh, trying to discuss, the problems. So those are the key takeaways, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So are there any other questions for Dr. Alex? I'll wait for 5 seconds, and if there are no hands up, I'll just assume that you either don't have any question or you prefer to directly communicate with Dr. Alex. 1, 2, okay. Alex wants to, okay, you have another Alex here. Hello, Alex. Go ahead. You need to unmute yourself. Hello.
Thank,
Yeah, please go ahead.
okay, thank you, Alayu and Dr. Alex. My question is goes to how can we just identify at the beginning of our research, the research journal? I mean, when you mention how to we publish our first paper, you said we need to identify the journal first. How can we be sure that can be our final journal to be published?
Yeah, that's a fair point because as you go through that journey and start collecting the data, it might start to tell a different story than what you were originally expecting. And you may need to focus on, go to a different journal, right? And so that's totally fair. Um, uh, if that happens, that's totally fine. Just, listen to the story that the data is telling you. And if it really is, going in a direction that maybe is suitable for a different journal, then just go and download that other template. It's not too big of a deal, but it is kind of a bit of a pain from a time perspective to migrate from one journal format to another. And so if you can do that earlier on, that's good. And the reason mainly why I say to download that template is because it'll tell you the way in which they want their figures formatted, which is the first step that you're going to take when kind of formulating your story that the data is going to tell you. And of course, all journals, they will put down a list of kind of topics and things like that that are relevant in the journal. And you may also notice certain papers that you are referencing, that you intend to reference in that paper, are coming from common journals, right? If that's the case, then it's a good indicator that the work you are going to be doing also belongs in that journal.
All right. Are there any other questions?
Can I add one more question?
Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you again. Now I'm in the second year of my PhD journey. Sometimes that I lost weight from reading, and even I can't concentrate my experiment work or simulation. Even just I totally forget all the things what I'm doing before. So, do- have you faced such kind of condition, and how do you manage?
So I'm going to repeat what I think I heard, and let me know if that is correct. You're in your second year, and you are doing a wide range of experiments. I think you maybe said on the computer, and sometimes you can't keep it all straight, and it's kind of demotivating that you're trying a whole bunch of different things, and then you can't keep it together in your head. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I fell into this myself, and uh, let's see here, where is it good? What you're falling into, or at least what I think you're falling into, is that you're still learning the techniques. You're learning how to which knobs to turn and what the results are kind of going to be at the other end, right? You're getting a feel for that still, so you're learning. But if you do that, do it in a structured way. Form a design of experiments, so to speak. So be very methodical with which knobs you are turning and document it. Keep track of those changes. I know that it is frustrating to do this because it takes time, and you feel that you would get more out of it if you just, tried one additional idea, one additional button, one additional menu selection. But I can assure you that over the course of months and a year, you will benefit greatly by writing down everything that you're doing, every button click that you're trying, and then documenting the results that way. It frees your mind from having to keep track of all of those things. And you prepare yourself, you put yourself in a great position when needing to write the paper.
Thank you very much.
Okay, are there any other questions? Oh, it was 5 seconds. After which I'll assume there are no other questions. Okay. Okay, in the absence of any other questions from the audience, I would like to again thank Dr. Alex for, putting so much time and energy to, share his knowledge, his experience, and, a bunch of suggestions and advice. Thank you very much, Dr. Alex, for your time, your energy, and for finding us worthy of, as an audience, to listen to your talk, your experiences, and your wisdom and everything. Thank you very much, Dr. Alex.
Thank you, all of you. Everyone has been fantastic. Really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Okay, guys, this is the end of the session. Thank you very much for joining. Yeah, bye.